Hi, welcome to Behavior-Driven Development, Baking in Quality with Specifications. Behavior-driven development is a technique that we leverage within the Agile Scrum world to build out highly contextual user stories with a very specific format that we leverage when writing test acceptance criteria. So before we kind of delve into the details of how we do this, I did want to give you a little bit of an overview of how did we get here? What were the driving factors for this behavior-driven development or BDD concept to get started? Well, back in the 90s, during the initial focus and development of the web, we had a lot of new techniques that really started coming out of that. We started moving out of the mainframe world of how we develop software and into a much faster paced environment. And that faster paced environment, though great for delivering things to customers very quickly, also had the unintended impact of delivering lower quality. So extreme programming was one of those kind of techniques and frameworks that came out to help developers kind of get through how they wanted to develop stuff quickly by writing tests before we actually wrote the code. So TDD, or test-driven development, is a way for developers to develop really high quality code very quickly by leveraging the technique of writing tests before writing code. And the problem with that is that even though we had well-tested code, very often we were not meeting our customers' needs or expectations. So around 2003, a web developer for ThoughtWorks by the name of Dan North, who had been leveraging TDD very well, very happy with the results, very proud of the fact, as he said, that he was delivering high quality code. The problem is when he would get into a demo with a customer, the customer would be like, yeah, great, Dan, that's great, but it still doesn't do what I want it to do. So high quality code, well-tested code is really not enough to deliver and meet customers' expectations. We actually have to deliver what they want. So Dan started realizing there was a disconnect between how the technical people were consuming stories and how the business people, the customer, were telling stories. And so he started working with a way to allow the customers, the business people, to have a way to communicate with the developers in their language. And so BDD was born of that desire and that need to provide customers with a way to provide us context about what they want without necessarily knowing or needing to know what the technical underpinnings were. And so, a customer doesn't care that we're going to update table XYZ, and they don't talk in that framework. So for us to have stories that reference very technical elements really makes it difficult for customers to talk to us. So BDD allows us to have that ability to have a good way of communicating without the technology getting in the way. So again, provide means for customers to describe the behavior of their features in non-technical terms. So what are the goals of BDD? Well, as with all Agile, we want to drive application development based upon business value. So BDD gets us focused in on delivering just what's needed and not anything more or anything less. So really keeping the customer focused on ensuring that we're delivering their highest business value needs first. As with TDD, we're really writing tests before we write code. You will hear a number of folks in the ATDD camp, the automated test-driven development camp, that this isn't really TDD, and technically it isn't, but in reality we're writing our acceptance tests in the BDD format before, and we should be writing them before we actually bring a story in for development. So this is, in my mind, a lot like the TDD notion that we're writing tests before we write code. Because we're working at the story level, we're working in small increments of work. It allows our teams to work quickly, test often, refactor as needed. One of the most important things for me is designing. It's really designed to illustrate the behavior of a feature. And my teams will always hear me say, what's the expected behavior of the system? And once you master this BDD technique, it's going to change the way you look at requirements, because you're going to all of a sudden be modeling in your head using the syntax of given, when, then to ask really, really good questions. What are the benefits? Well, for me, one of the most important ones is that we're encouraging close teamwork between the entire project team or the entire Scrum team. That's important because through the good communication and development of BDD with the entire team, we develop a high level of context. That context leads to a clear understanding of what's being developed. It also provides us with a clear definition of ready and done. You'll also hear it called out in the wild, so to speak, is specification by example. Gojko Adsec wrote a book several years ago by that title, and the book really is foundational in that it provides clear evidence based upon his research that organizations that have fully adopted BDD as their means of writing test acceptance for their features and stories will deliver higher quality, and do it much more quickly. So just like, specification by example and BDD are one and the same for the most part. You are really defining the process by which teams will build software through these very effective examples, which really define the behavior of the system. So we're also going to be defining requirements through examples, which again puts the entire team into the mix. So when we look at specification by example, we're really talking about defining a behavior, which we do so by creating examples. And each row in our example table becomes an individual test or validation of that behavior. Because we're doing this, we're building high levels of context, and at the end, we're really developing test acceptance criteria that we can leverage to build both test automation and confirm that the system does what it's supposed to do. So what's the process? Well, the team is going to be focused on identifying acceptance criteria that support the user story in the feature before any code is written. Meaning you're going to do this in the sprint before it comes into your development sprint. We're going to have a complete review of those examples, and we're going to obtain sign-off, though that's kind of a misnomer. But we're going to get everybody on the team to agree that the examples are everything in the examples or in the example table for that particular story are complete, and we won't bring that in until the sprint the sprint is ready. So we get a definition of ready. Coding is complete, and a feature can be implemented when all the acceptance criteria pass. Now, pass can mean that we can develop it from an automation perspective, or we can just test it manually. Either way, we will show every row in that example table having a pass that we can show our product owner. So what are the benefits of examples? Well, again, as we've mentioned before, it creates a high level of business value because we're only developing what's needed, nothing more, nothing less. And as I've seen over the years, quality increases when developers and testers are on the same page with all of this. So if the developer knows that they have to code a feature so that it satisfies each row in that example table, and a tester knows that they're going to be testing just for that, it really gets us focused in on exactly what we need to do to deliver high quality. And one of the other things that it does is it really identifies the scope boundary for each story. So when we find something, and it happens, when we find something that we missed in an example table, oh wait, I didn't think about this particular outcome, in that. Instead of trying to add it to the story, we just talk to the product owner, and there's no finger pointing. Just talk to the product owner, write up another story, and put it in the backlog. Really helps remove a lot of the stress that sometimes we feel when we miss stuff. Who's responsible? Well, I think you've kind of heard already from me. It's the entire team. And there's different processes that we can take to develop BDD. Functionally, what I've seen with a number of different organizations is that we usually have a smaller subset of people who are involved in doing the initial write-up and elaboration. So, for example, at Disney, our product owner and a QA person would be responsible for fleshing out the user stories. The product owner would identify our requirements, etc., and the QA would write the BDD to validate what the story was saying. Once that was done, then the developers, right before we brought the work into the sprint, would review it to confirm that they agreed or not, and would put their design kind of concepts together so they know what they were going to be doing. So it became a very disciplined cycle that the beginning of a sprint, the PO and the QA were working on this, and then the developers would look at it at the end of the sprint, and then rinse and repeat. So during this review, as we go through it though, the team will add examples. Again, sign off, probably a bit of a misnomer. It's kind of the concept we used at Disney, but we want the team to agree that all the examples have been reviewed before we bring it into the sprint. So what's the story? Well, the story is we're going to take a story and we're going to review those user stories that we want to consider for the next sprint and or the bigger features, and we're going to create a test scenario outline. We want to understand that we can really understand the stories. So if I have a story and I can't write any kind of test scenario outline, the story's probably not at the right place it needs to be. I don't understand it enough. It's too low. It's just so big I don't even know where to start. So this allows you to really feel like you understand the story if you can create a test scenario outline. So let's take a very basic story. It's as a customer, I want to withdraw cash from an ATM so that I don't have to wait in line at the bank. So we have appears to be pretty clear ask. As a customer, I want to get money out of an ATM so I don't have to go to the bank. That's my value add. I don't have to go into the bank to get it. So as we start looking at this, we can come up with a couple of really quick test scenarios. First one is the account is in credit, and the second one is account is overdrawn. But then also you start thinking, well, what other variables in this story that aren't defined? And again, stories are designed and written in a way to encourage conversation. So your story should not have very specific requirements in it. If you're writing stories that have business rules or requirements in it, the story is not being written correctly. The story is supposed to be vague enough and open enough to encourage conversation. So as a customer, I want to withdraw cash from an ATM so I don't have to wait in line at a bank. It speaks nothing about what about a credit or overdraw. It also doesn't speak anything about who our customer is. Personal, business, corporate. What kind of accounts might be involved? Savings, checking, credit. I mean, we just don't know. So this story, basic, is also fairly big, and we don't know exactly what we want to do here. But we do know that we started with the notion of our account is in credit and our account is overdrawn. So what does that scenario do for you? Well, first and foremost, you want to describe the scenario in plain language. Don't use numbering systems or anything like that. Speak in the language of the business that domain. Account is in credit, account is overdrawn. Primarily, the scenario is going to encourage deeper conversations amongst the team. Scenarios can also help us understand if a story is too big or too small. Is it inclusive of another story? And we'll get more into how we can leverage BDD for sizing a little bit later in this particular tutorial. We'll also be able to, with our scenarios, identify things that we hadn't thought of yet, or because of project timelines, determine what we won't or will or won't do. And so in this particular case, we might say, hey, we're not going to support business or savings accounts in the first release. We're just going to do checking. So again, it allows you to have, as a team, a good conversation of what it is we're going to start off on. So BDD is all about creating examples. That's our real focus with all of this. But as I coach a lot of folks on this around the world, one of the things that you have to understand is BDD is actually two different components. There's the given when then, which is really the foundational piece of how we write our test acceptance criteria. And this is deceptively simple. But when you actually start doing this, it really triggers a lot of thought, and it really triggers you to really delve into what this potential thing that we're developing is and how it really should behave. So at its simplest, it's given, when, then. Given some precondition, when a particular action happens, then some outcome will happen. We use ands in between the givens and the whens and the ands and the thens to set up additional post-conditional variability within that particular feature or story. If it kind of seems like a use case, for me it kind of is. I mean, it doesn't have all the arrows and the dots and all that other stuff, and there's not boxes and all that good stuff. It's just very simple, reads like a paragraph. But it like a good use case, it defines the boundaries of what we're doing. So it sets up the precondition. Where am I starting from with this particular feature? It's very important from a development and testing perspective. And where am I going to end up at? What's the final state of this particular feature? Now, if you're doing some research out on the internet and want to learn a bit more about BDD, you'll also note that when you do that, BDD is really almost 100% about automation. If you go out onto the internet, that's what you're going to see a lot of, is that people think of BDD as an automation tool. It really isn't. Automation is really icing on the cake. You can get great value from doing this whole process of writing tests this way, even if you don't have automation. At NCR, where I was a QA manager, we didn't have automation when I got there, but I still had my team start writing tests in this format. They ended up writing tests that were, much deeper in understanding. They probably wrote about 30% more tests. And once my testers started writing their tests in this format, didn't take long for the developers to realize, hey, if you're going to write it this way, I should probably get this ahead of time so that I know what you're going to be testing and can develop it appropriately. In doing your research, you might also hear that this is Gherkin. So this relates to another way that the given, when, then has been referenced in things such as SpecFlow tool for writing BDD, test acceptance automation. And no, we're not talking about the pickle. So when we start looking at setting up our first test, we really need to spend some time thinking about the given, when, then. And we are going to start thinking about what are the elements that we want to test. For example, what are the user types? What are some preconditions that might have to happen, for this user to transact something to get the outcome that we're trying to develop? The whole process is about developing what I call contextually rich user stories, and this process will really get you thinking quite a bit about the requirement and how we're going to define it. So let's start building our first test, the given and the preconditions. So let's go back to our story. As a customer, I want to withdraw cash from an ATM so that I don't have to wait in line at the bank. Scenario 1, again, my account is in credit. So given I am a customer with a valid account and my account is in credit. Scenario 2, account is overdrawn. Given I'm a customer with a valid account and my account is overdrawn. Now notice, we've already introduced something that isn't actually called out in the story. Nowhere in the story did we determine that there was a valid account. So as I started writing this, I realized, well, in order for me to get cash out of an ATM, I got to have a valid account. So we declared that as part of our given. That's the precondition. This particular development and the testing that I'm going to do for this is all predicated upon somebody having a valid account. If I have an invalid account, that'll be a whole different way that we'll handle that. You'll get different messaging, etc. So what should we be looking for? Well, one of the things we're going to do as we start developing this and do this on a continual basis is that we're going to be creating steps. So given I am a user and let's say I want to log in to a website, that's a consistent step. We may do that thousands of times in all of our tests. That is important because in building a set of repeatable steps in our automation, if, for example, login changes, if we write one step, and this is all supported in tools like Cucumber and such, if we write one step for login, if login changes, we just have one test to change. If you write 1,000 login and automate 1,000, let's say, login steps for each of the stories that you're doing that leverage login, when login changes, you're going to have 1,000 tests to change. So these are the things you really have to think through when you're building your test automation framework. But the steps also get you thinking about what are the steps that I'm going to be testing. We're going to be adding preconditions to further define the behavior. We don't want to try to include everything in a single given statement, and that is a common mistake when we first start doing this. Just the same as when we start writing user stories, we're trying to cram a bunch of requirements into a story. So we use something we call a parameter around particular words in our given when then test acceptance writing to identify where a variable will actually be. So given I am a user, if we put parameters around it, that allows us then to have a dynamic set of tests for more than one user type. So anything that you put in that parameter will become a separate test, will actually become a separate column that ends up becoming a separate test. And you'll see this in just a little bit. So now we're getting to the when. And so as a customer, I want to withdraw cash from an ATM so I don't have to wait in line at the bank. Same items are unchanged. Now I've got an valid account. My account is in credit or it's overdrawn. And then when I withdraw money from my bank, so from my account. So right now the when statement is the same for both. I'm trying to withdraw money from my account. So when you think about using the when statement, really try to focus all the time on keeping it to one specific action. When I select submit, or when I press enter, or etc. There are examples where a when can be have multiple options, but basically your focus should be on keeping that when statement to just one item, one particular action. If it isn't, then you probably haven't quite got the story and the test to the level that you need to be. There is an example with one customer that I worked with where they used a wizard for enrollment, and each page had actually 3 options. For the when statement would be, so I've selected all the wizard items. When I do something, it could be continue, cancel, or go back. So there are cases where the when can be multiple, but it does make it difficult to keep the test clean. You also want to ensure that your when statement is not a precondition, and I still have to check myself on this. So this is just something that you always want to be asking. What you'll find when you start using BDD to write test acceptance criteria is that oftentimes you'll be coming back to rewrite them because you realize the when is really an and. And so it's very common for you to do that. So it's something to pay attention to make sure that when is a single action. All right, so building the test. Now we're at the then statement. What's the outcome? So same story, same set of things leading up to the when I withdraw money from my account. Now we get to, then my account should be debited. So in the account is in credit, my account should be debited, and the requested amount should be dispensed. However, on the overdrawn, I get a different outcome. Then I should receive an error message, and the requested amount should not be dispensed. Now notice, I've now put up another requirement that doesn't have itself specifically called out in the story, and that's the error message. When we start writing BDD, we tend to uncover things that are not explicitly called out in the story, and that's what we want. So the then statement, again, keep it to the expected result, the outcome that is identified in the when statement. We can use ands to further identify more than one step for an outcome, and that's very common. And I'll show you some examples of that in just a little bit here. Um, One of the things you want to focus in on, just for good writing format for BDD, anytime you have an and, put it on a separate line. Don't run your ands on a single line. It makes it very difficult to read. By doing that, you're also kind of hiding the complexity and behavior of the system because it is hard to read. So you really want to focus in on that, because that also provides you a cleaner way of writing your test automation scripts as well. The tools will operate more cleanly and nicely if you write your tests so that it's given and when and when then. So parameters, we've kind of touched on it. This is the real power of BDD. If you find that you're writing a test that just has given, when, then, and there's no parameters, the story is probably really low, because that given, when, then ultimately ends up being a single test. And there's not a lot of value in going to the level of trying to write BDD if we can't get example tables. So one of the things you'll find too is that stories tend to be a little bit higher level, and then we break them down that way with BDD. So if I have multiple tests and I can identify from my scenarios, do I have to write out a scenario for each one? Actually, no. You can use parameters to bring stories into a smaller subset of scenarios. And you'll find as you do this, it takes about 5 to 7 weeks to really get comfortable writing BDD if you do it consistently. And what you're going to find is in week 1, you're going to write tests that are lots of scenarios and smaller tests, but over time you'll end up writing more contextually rich BDD by using the parameters to bring in various things that we can test in the same story. Where can you use parameters? In the given, then, and statements. Do not use them really for the when, because we do not want the when to have, as I said, multiple conditions. Work very hard to keep your when to a single action. How are parameters identified in the steps? Well, they're identified again by using that caret. We're enclosing our variables. So we also have some guidelines for parameter naming. So as you're writing your parameters, keep them to really meaningful names. Don't use technical terms in your variables like and the user will update table XYZ. Don't do that because as a customer, I'm not going to know that. They should be very descriptive of the expected behavior or the outcome. This is going to make everything just easier to read. So let's rewrite what we just walked through using parameters so you can see how we can take 2 tests and turn it into something a lot more concise and readable. One of the things that you'll also notice, we can do a lot of what if with this, and we can certainly get into that in our next BDD deep dive. So the story was, as a customer, I want to withdraw cash from an ATM. So before we wrote, given I am a customer with a valid checking account and my checking account is in credit, all the way through slowly. Now I've rewritten it so that given I'm a user and I have a valid account and my account is in credit, then when I withdraw money from my account, then my account should be debited and the requested amount should be dispensed. So wherever we put a parameter, that becomes a column in our example table, and then we're going to use that example table and those columns to start to define the outcome, the behavior, the data set that will drive our tests. So by using parameters and example tables for our permutations, we come up with this particular way of writing tests. Notice we're going to use a pipe that delimits the columns. This is important. We need to write the tests in this format so that we can copy them right into our automation frameworks. So there are many test automation frameworks out there that will leverage BDD written in this way, and it's really find the language that you're comfortable writing in, and then you can go to town on this. So you'll notice here we've got user, so I've got consumer and small business. So in each row of the example table, you'll notice that I've got user consumer, account type checking, my account is in credit, money's debited, money's dispensed. Now the next one is consumer checking, and then in credit, no, debited, no, dispensed, no. And then we rinse and repeat throughout the entire example table to get the right set of behaviors. So in this particular test, we have defined the expected outcome for accounts that are consumer or small business who have checking and savings accounts and who are looking at trying to get money out of the ATM. So we have a BDD review. And that, again, is really important with the teams to really hone in on what we're doing. Again, it's just kind of reiterating, it's very important for everybody to be involved in the development of BDD. So I said earlier that we had we could use BDD to assess the size of a story and to determine if it's too big or not. So one of the first ways we can do it, and this is kind of just things I've learned over the years, is that number of test scenarios. So if a particular story has more than, say, 4 test scenarios, individual test scenarios, you're probably going to want to consider breaking that story down. And this becomes especially true if each scenario has a lot of tests in it. What that ends up really meaning is that the size of the story is too big to really complete in a sprint, and it may also have a level of complexity to it that isn't readily noticeable right off the bat. The next way that we can really look at breaking stories down is by the number of tests in an individual example table. So if you have a story with an individual example table that has more than, say, 15 tests in it, you're also going to want to think about breaking that story down into a couple of different test scenarios so that you're clear on what you're really trying to do. So here, it's kind of the intersection of complexity now and size are going to impact your ability to deliver and deliver a high quality feature. One of the other things that you want to focus in on is also the estimation side of things. So if things are so big, it's a little harder to automate it. Also, from an automation perspective, we want to really focus in on keeping these tests small, because as we automate it and put it into our CI tool, the ability to really focus in on what part of the test broke, because BDD allows you to identify every specific step that breaks, so you know exactly what feature broke in what step. Keeping these things small really allows you to hone in on where things are breaking. The last way that we can kind of break up a story is by the number of parameters or columns in our example table. So again, if we have a example table that has just a set of columns that are just kind of extending off into the horizon to the right, more than about 9, probably a good indication that you want to break that story down as well, for the same reasons that we would do it for the number of tests in an example table. Now, these are not hard and fast rules, but these are things and guidelines that you want to pay attention to so that you keep your stories right-sized. So here's some examples of real-world BDD, and this is a organization that I worked with previously, where we're doing a dining reservation module, and here you can see where we had the story. As a guest, I want to be able to search for table time availability at a restaurant from the overview page, so on and so forth. You'll see here in our conversation section that we've started identifying, kind of the requirements. We've got some creative assumptions, technical assumptions. We have some business rules identified. This conversation section is generally left out in a lot of stories, and we write the story at the very top, and we try to write tests right away after that. Take the time, go through your conversation, document what is going to be a part of that particular story, and I highly encourage using a format like this to really keep everybody on the same page from a story development perspective. And so this is what a BDD statement would look like as we start writing it. So you'll notice we've got a user, an affiliation, an offer, so on and so forth. Now, one thing I'll point out is if your column, like the offer and product columns in the page 2 column, if those are all the same value, you don't need to parameterize them. You just make those a declaration. So, and I have searched for an offer for a product. And for an offer, you can say, and I have searched for rack product, and I have searched and for package. So we're declaring very specifically. So keep an eye on that so that your variables are just the things that are changing. That'll also help you keep your stories small as well. And this is what a set of BDD would look like if you put it into Cucumber and ran it. So here we have a particular scenario of optional display. This is just something that I did with a client a while back while we were having a little bit of boot camp, and I wanted to give them an example of how easy it was. So we spent about 15 minutes writing some BDD, and then I put that into Cucumber. And you'll notice here in Cucumber is that before we've written any test automation code, Cucumber will fail everything. So again, kind of like TDD. We've written the test, everything failed. So we have one scenario that's undefined in 7 steps. Now what Cucumber does for you, and all these tools do for you, is that when you write the BDD and run the test, it actually generates the file that you're going to use to write the code. So you'll see here, given, and then I am user, then it says do, and everything in the pending section there, that's where you're going to write your code. So this was particularly run in Ruby. So there I'm going to write my Ruby code that's going to validate who that user is. And so it really sets it up for you very easily so that you can, it tells you where to write your code to start your automation. And just one last example, as you can see, it's telling you to, where to put the regex to write your code, and again, makes it very, very clear. So that is the introduction to behavior-driven development. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us via the Contact Us or the info at SoundAgile. Thank you again for purchasing this tutorial. We also offer additional coaching, so if you'd like to have some one-on-one coaching on this and walk through your specific stories and such, very happy to do that. So look forward to talking with you, and have a great day.